A little disclaimer, I'm not gonna be held responsible if y'all start sobbing over this story because whew, it is definitely a lot. Hey everyone, welcome back to my channel. If you're new, don't forget to hit the subscribe button down below and turn on your post notifications so you don't miss any of my uploads. I can't believe we're already on our second week of January. Time is going way too fast for me, but we're here, we're reading books, we're talking about books, so stay tuned so I can give you some more books to add on your TBR for this year. As you can tell by the title, today I'm going to be sharing my top 10 fantasy books to read, which includes some of my all-time favorite books ever. I'm gonna give you books that are more plot driven, that are more politically motivated, fantasy romance, historical fantasy, paranormal fantasy. I'm gonna cover all the bases in fantasy so you all have recommendations and genres and niches that you love. There are gonna be books I've mentioned on my channel before, but also books that I haven't really gone into depth with. So I'm super excited to share this list with you all because I can talk about these books all day long, but we don't got time for that, so I'm gonna give it to y'all straight. So let's talk and reach our many Enni endings. Let's get right into the video. The first section of books that I'm going to be sharing with you all are books that are more politically motivated, meaning that the characters in these books are driven towards some larger goal than themselves. I know that there are a lot of books in fantasy that are kind of in the same route, but I wanted to do this section in particular because these set of books don't particularly have a romance or a large romance component that other fantasy books would normally have. The main crux of this section is that these characters are more driven towards reaching something that is kind of out of their control and are working to achieve that goal with other characters. So the first fantasy book that I have to recommend on my list is one of my all-time favorites, and that is Six of Crows by Leigh Bardugo. There are definitely mixed reviews about the Six of Crows duology. Either people love it or people seriously hate it. I completely understand this sentiment. Six of Crows follows a set of characters and different points of views, ultimately share a story about a grand heist that is going on. The duology itself, Six of Crows and Crooked Kingdom, follow two different heists, but follow the same characters as they learn how to work with each other, and it's not the general politics in that there's a governing person that's oppressive and they're trying to overthrow that, but rather they're more politically motivated within themselves and their own hierarchies and ranks. And they're basically the bad guys when it comes to politics. And having said that, this duology definitely follows characters that are morally gray, that definitely have a sketchy background, but you fall in love with them anyways. Y'all know that I eat morally gray characters up. In this duology, I love that the characters aren't clean cut. They're so different. I just love that. The sense of loyalty in these books are especially something that I adore and love to read about. I also understand the mixed reviews because Six of Crows definitely has to get a little getting used to. If you're someone who doesn't like things that are drawn out, you may not like this duology because it does take a little time to get formalized in the world. I love going behind the scenes and seeing what characters are doing that leads up to a climax or a point in a story that just wows you. And I will say that this duology is great if you are really character driven because you get to know these characters one-on-one for real, in their head, in their thoughts, but also get to see the perspectives of other characters and how they interact with each other. The second book that I want to recommend in this section is Raybearer. I read this book in 2020. I have not had a chance to talk about how much I love this book. Raybearer is a YA fantasy. This story follows a girl named Teresa who is set in a kingdom where the crown prince is about to choose his council of 11. Now, this council in this world is really special because all 11 members has the power of the Ray. The Ray power is a really strong and special bond that the council members has with the prince because they're the ones that guide him, counsel him, and ultimately protect him. And so through this power, they can hear each other's thoughts, connect with one another. So it's a really serious ceremony for the prince to choose these 11 people. Now our main character, Teresa, has grown up in isolation. She was more so groomed to be a person that the lady who kind of acts like her mother in this instance to carry out the lady's goals. And ultimately, this goal is that Teresa would train and become one of the council members. However, the reason being is that the lady ultimately family wants Terasai to kill the crown prince. So in the story, Terasai has to choose whether or not her bond and her friendship with the crown prince will outweigh her bond and closeness to the lady, i.e. her mother, and see if she can carry out this sentence. I loved this book. I feel like it's not talked about as much, and I honestly don't know why, because it's great fantasy. It has such a great magic system as well as amazing characters, but also their interactions are that of teenagers, and I appreciate that so much. Jordan allows these characters to learn and experience and make mistakes because they are kids. They don't know everything that's going on. They have this huge responsibility that's put on them. They carry it out as they see fit. So I love the character development in all of them. And another thing that I love and adore in books is loyalty and royalty. Any book with a test to loyalty is something that's completely up my alley and I adore. That's exactly what Raybearer gives you. But if you love royalty, tests to loyalty, magic systems, possible betrayal, this is definitely up your alley. I literally love the writing, the world building, the characters, the magic system. It has it all, so I highly recommend. The last book that I have to recommend in the politically motivated genre of fantasy is Jade City by Fonda Lee. Jade City is probably the most politically motivated book that I have to recommend in this section because this is an adult fantasy. This book follows an intergenerational blood feud, politics, a rare magic system, and lots and lots and lots of violence. Jade City is book 1 of the Greenbone saga, and in this book we follow the Call family, who ultimately dictates and controls the island of Kikon. On this island, they're able to produce a rare type of magic. It's fueled by jade. It gives you superhuman strength, abilities, but of course, since there is this magic that is able to make people stronger, make them warriors, and basically make them indestructible, there are people who are power hungry for this superpower as well. So the Call family is not only under threat from other people who want these jades, but they're also under threat from other jade warriors. And so we follow this family and these characters as they go to war and they battle each other and hopefully find some resolve between two kind of feuding circles. This was an amazing read, and I really wanted to include it in this list because if you are new to fantasy, this is a great book for beginners. The magic system is super easy to follow, the plotline is really steady, and the writing is phenomenal. In this book, you're definitely taken to the island of Kikon, surrounded by all this jade magic. You want to pick sides. That's an amazing experience to have in any book, but especially one with such political intrigue, because the fate of an entire community rests on these characters, and the high stakes it presents is something I absolutely adore in books. So if that is something up your alley, I definitely recommend starting with Jade City. Next section of fantasy that I want to cover are more plot-driven books. So something that's happening internally with that character that is now spewing externally versus the political intrigue section that was more guided by external figures motivating the characters themselves. But the first book that I have to recommend in this genre is a book that I constantly talk about on my channel now, and that is Crescent City by Sarah J. Maas. I keep calling it Crescent City, but the actual title is House of Earth and Blood. But this book was entirely amazing. It was such a great experience. I have an entire reading vlog. If you want to check it out, it'll be up here and in the description box. This story follows Bryce, who is a girl that is known for partying, drinking, and having a good time. Fueled by grief, Bryce is trying to find out the culprit who murdered her best friend because she feels that there are things that aren't adding up. And so as Bryce becomes the center of the investigation because she was the one that found her best friend murdered, Bryce gets paired up with one of the investigators who happens to be an angel named Hunt. So as they pair up to solve this murder mystery, they also uncover a lot of secrets that are unraveling around these cities and the groups that live within Crescent City. A lot of personal stakes that are in this book. I loved following the characters. They are phenomenal. And it was so atmospheric that you felt that you were in there with these characters. I'll know how I feel about Miss Sarah J. Maas. A little disclaimer, I'm not gonna be held responsible if y'all start sobbing over this story because whew, it is definitely a lot. But I love that for y'all, so I'm not even mad about it. Another book from an author I love and definitely made me cry was The Lady Midnight by Cassandra Clare. The Lady Midnight is book 1 of the Dark Artifices series, and this is a sequel series to Cassandra Clare's The Mortal Instruments. And in this book, we follow a set of shadow hunters. This world Cassandra Clare has built 5 years after the ending of The Mortal Instruments in the last book, City of Heavenly Fire. That series, a large war erupted and definitely shifted the shadow hunter world itself. And in this series, we follow Emma Carstairs, found herself motivated to avenge her parents' death from the war that had occurred. And so Emma and her best friend and parabatai, Julian Blackthorn, starts investigating this lead of demonic presences that are existent in Los Angeles, which is where this book takes place. Unlike Cassandra Clare's other books, this takes place in more modern times. There are fairies, there are angels, there are demons, there are wolves. So this is also very similar to the way Crescent City is formulated. Unlike Crescent City, which is a more new adult, this is definitely a true young adult fantasy. This is probably my favorite series of Cassandra Clare's. Something great about Cassandra Clare's series are that you don't have to read the entirety of the Shadowhunter world in order to understand what this series is going to be about. But if you haven't read Cassandra Clare, I definitely recommend reading this series or getting on top of it, because I fell in love and got my heart broken in this story. There's so much at stake, and I think the stakes in this series is why I love this series more than any of the other books, because Emma is so motivated in herself. She kind of holds the entire world on her shoulders. But also, my favorite part of this series is following Julian Blackthorn. Julian is probably one of my favorite characters. I'm saying a lot because I fall in love with characters so easily. He is raising his siblings and younger shadow hunters with no real parental guidance. And so he's just completely overwhelmed, but he's so loyal to Emma and the way that she wants to avenge her parents that he always goes out his way to support his parabatai and his friend. I just adore Julian so much. I'm kind of getting emotional talking about Julian because I literally just love him so much. So if you're ready for a heartbreak, you want to fall in love with a character so deeply, then this is definitely the series for you. But of course, that is not the only book that I can recommend that can make you tear up and fall in love with characters. The last book I have to recommend in this section of the fantasy books that I want to recommend is Cemetary Boys by Aiden Thomas. I read this book in December and mentioned it in my December wrap-up, which will be up here and in the description box. This was such an amazingly written YA fantasy. Cemetary Boys has such amazing rep, amazing writing, amazing characters, such a unique magic system that I've never seen in any other books. In Cemetery Boys, we followed this trans boy named Yadriel and a spirit that he had summoned named Julian. So as Yadriel tries to prove himself to his family that he is indeed a boy, that he belongs in this Brujex community. Such a beautifully crafted story, and I love the cultural component of this story as well. If you're looking for a great YA fantasy read that just makes your heart lunge for these characters, Cemetery Boys by Aiden Thomas is definitely it. The next section of books that I want to recommend is definitely in the fantasy romance niche. The first book that I want to recommend in this section is A Court of Thorns and Roses by Sarah J. Maas. I mean, I have mentioned this book in my latest videos constantly now, and I'm sure y'all are tired of hearing it. But A Court of Thorns and Roses by Sarah J. Maas is definitely a top tier book when it comes to romance fantasies. This is a developing series by Sarah J. Maas, which has 3 books out right now and a novella, and the 4th book is coming out this year. But it follows a girl named Feyre who was initially a human but has now been thrown into a fairy world. I'm not gonna lie, I didn't like A Court of Thorns and Roses, also known as Akotar, as much as I liked the 2 following books, but I put it in this category because this is definitely a romance heavy fantasy. The romance and smut in this series is beyond me. So if you love a steamy romance and great world building, this series is definitely for you. Brings me to book 2 in this section, which is another fantasy romance series called From Blood and Ash by Jennifer L. Armentrout. I talk about this book all the time. I have an entire review on it, so if you want to hear my thoughts, I'll link it up here and in the description box. In this book, we follow Poppy, who is known as a maiden, aka a person that can't be touched, looked at in order to preserve her innocence. Of course, that all changes when Hawk is thrown into the mix and into her life. And initially, as a protection detail, Hawk is now guarding the maiden. A whole host of things erupt. Enemy lines get crossed, generational secrets get revealed, and creatures of the night come running in and exposing everything. I want to mention this book because book 3 is also coming out this year. So you're gonna want to get your hands on that. This book also has a smut and romance that you definitely want to push for. If you're into that, as well as a paranormal aspect in the creatures that are involved, this book and series is definitely up your alley. Speaking of paranormal, the next book that I have is in the paranormal genre of fantasy. And the book that I want to recommend is Crave by Tracy Wolff. I have an entire review of Crave on my channel up here and in the description box. I'm sure y'all know that book 2 of this developing series by Tracy Wolff was definitely not my favorite. However, I still want to recommend because it definitely was such an amazing book and the greatest experience that I had reading a paranormal fantasy in terms of following kind of the Twilight-esque field. It's definitely not Twilight. I feel like the characters are definitely more well done. The storyline is a little bit more interesting than it is in Twilight. In the story, we follow Grace, a girl who has tragically lost her parents to an accident, is now thrown into a boarding school in Alaska. Little did she know, Grace is at a boarding school for paranormal creatures such as vampires, werewolves, dragons, gargoyles, and the whole lot. Of course, as Grace goes to the new school, she also meets resident bad boy Jackson. As the writing's corny, the relationship is corny, a great read to experience. And the third book of this series also comes out this year. So I definitely want to recommend it if y'all are interested in paranormal romances. Although I didn't like book 2, I definitely am getting book 3 because I'm really invested to see how this world kind of expands. Because although it has the vampire werewolf kind of feel, Tracy also includes so many different characters that we don't see together, such as witches and dragons and gargoyles. I'm really interested to see how those set of characters also expand. And the last book that I have to recommend is in the kind of historical fantasy genre, or fantasies that have a very large historical basis. And that book is Kindred by Octavia Butler. Octavia Butler is definitely one of my favorite writers. So eloquent in the way that she's able to weave such historical contexts in fantasies, especially involving conversations of race, slavery, and the historical significance of it all. Kindred follows the main character, Dana, who is this black woman living in contemporary times. She suddenly gets thrown back into antebellum times where slavery is still present. So this book not only is a historical fiction, but it also has science fiction elements. So I really wanted to recommend this book because it definitely dives into different genres and subsections in a way that I've never seen this discussion and dialogue presented for in a book. But alright everyone, that is the list of my top 10 fantasy book recommendations that I have for you to add onto your 2021 reading list. So which book do you want to add on your list? Let me know in the comment section below. Follow me on all my social media. It's all linked in the description below, as well as my Amazon wishlist. And tune in because every Monday on my channel I host reading sprints so you and I and some of my other friends can come and read together. But alright y'all, happy reading, and until next time, bye!